The terrifying reality brought by one of the most effective and downright devastating weapons of World War II, the German Flak, from towering 88mm guns that could rip through heavy bombers to smaller calibers that turned low-flying aircraft into scrap. The Flak was more than just a defensive tool. It was a psychological weapon that haunted Allied pilots day and night. In this video, we're diving deep into the story of Germany's Flak. How it evolved, how it dominated the skies, the real voice from a young German soldier who manned one, and why it became such a feared legend of the war. The sun was already baking the rolling fields around Arras when Rommel's scouts brought word. British tanks, Matildas, dozens of them, were grinding toward his positions. It was May 21st, 1940, and Rommel's 7th Panzer Division had been advancing confidently through France, swinging north of Arras to encircle Allied forces. But now, what should have been an unstoppable thrust was in danger of being ripped apart. Rommel rushed forward on foot, dust swirling around his boots, scanning the horizon through his field glasses. In the distance, the Matildas rumbled on, shrugging off direct hits from the standard German 37mm pack guns. Rommel watched shell after shell ricochet off their thick steel hides. One Matilda was reported to have taken over a dozen hits already, with only chipped paint to show for it. It was an emergency. Rommel's mind raced. The smaller guns were worthless here. He ordered every available 88mm flak gun forward, dragging them up at a frantic pace, sweating gunners throwing themselves into position. These were anti-aircraft guns by design. Towering, cumbersome, but they had the range and punch to smash heavy armor if sighted right. Personally directing the crews, Rommel ran from piece to piece, his voice hoarse from shouting firing coordinates. In a broad arc, he positioned the guns across the ridgeline, overlapping fields of fire into a deadly net. As the Matildas drew into the trap, the first shots thundered out. The shells screamed through the air and struck home with devastating force. Great gouts of flame burst from British turrets, crews scrambling to bail out as secondary explosions ripped their machines apart. That day, near Arras, Rommel's improvised flak front destroyed wave after wave of British armour, shattering the counterattack and preserving the drive toward the Channel. The British would never forget it, or the sight of Matildas left burning on the French roads. A year later, in the harsh, shimmering heat of the Libyan desert, Rommel's Afrika Korps would perfect these deadly tactics. During Operation Battleaxe in June 1941, British Matilda tanks once again pressed forward, believing their armour made them nearly invincible. Behind them marched infantry of the 11th Indian Brigade, counting on the Matildas to smash any German resistance. But hidden in shallow scrapes, camouflaged under desert nets and light brush, 13 Flak 88s waited. When the first Matildas struck concealed mines and ground to a halt, tracks blown apart, the German gunners pulled their triggers. Muzzles flashed, sand and rock erupted underfoot, and one company of the Royal Tank Regiment was obliterated in the opening salvo. Panicked radio calls crackled through the British columns. The Matilda's own short guns couldn't reach the dug-in flaks, and their machine guns were laughably inadequate. By day's end, 123 British tanks lay wrecked or abandoned, a staggering toll out of only 238 sent into battle. The legend of the Matilda's invulnerability was dead, replaced by a new fear whispered across Allied lines, the fear of the dreaded German 88. This was the Flak's true genius under Rommel, not merely a gun, but the backbone of a cunning battlefield strategy that turned air defense into a mobile tank-killing doctrine. From France to the burning sands of Africa, Rommel's carefully placed gun lines cut down armoured advances again and again, leaving scorched earth littered with twisted metal. The German 88mm gun stands out as one of the most feared and recognisable artillery pieces of the Second World War, earning its fearsome reputation through a combination of lethal precision and devastating firepower. Known formally as the Flugabwehrkanone, literally aircraft defence cannon, the name was quickly abbreviated by troops and civilians alike to the simpler and now infamous term Flak. Though it gained global notoriety as the scourge of Allied bombers and tanks during World War II, the roots of this powerful gun stretched back decades earlier to the trenches and battlefields of the First World War. In the latter stages of 1916, the German army began adapting its proven naval gun designs for use on land, seeking ways to bolster their heavy artillery capabilities amid the grinding attrition on the Western Front. Leading industrial giants such as Krupp AG and Rheinmetall were already well versed in crafting large-caliber barrels and their formidable ammunition. However, the crushing stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, designed to keep Germany militarily neutered, prohibited the manufacture of many heavy weapons, forcing German engineers to find creative loopholes. Under this shadow of restriction, Krupp collaborated quietly with the Swedish firm Bofors to continue developing heavy anti-aircraft artillery, sidestepping Allied oversight by leveraging Sweden's neutrality. By 1928, these clandestine efforts bore fruit in the form of the first prototype of what would become the famed line of 88mm cannons. Officially designated the Flak 18, these early models were ingeniously mounted on a cruciform carriage, granting them an unparalleled ability to traverse a full 360 degrees, crucial for tracking and engaging fast-moving aircraft or rapidly redeploying to face ground threats. Even more impressively, the firing platform could be stabilized by lowering the axle-mounted bogies, enhancing accuracy and reducing recoil displacement during sustained bombardments. What truly set the Flak 18 apart from many contemporaries was its sophisticated breech mechanism that automatically ejected spent casings and recocked itself for the next round, enabling a skilled crew to maintain an extraordinary rate of fire of up to 20 shots per minute. This blistering pace of sustained fire, coupled with its high muzzle velocity, gave it a lethal edge not only against aircraft, but also against armoured vehicles and fortified positions, a dual utility that would later change the course of countless land battles. However, this ferocious rate of fire came at a cost. The original one-piece barrels of the Flak 18 had a relatively short operational lifespan, typically needing replacement after about 900 rounds, a task often performed right there in the field, under tense conditions. When Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists seized power in 1933, Germany's clandestine rearmament programs ramped up into overt mass production. Factories turned out increasing numbers of these guns, which would soon make their combat debut on foreign soil. During Germany's intervention in the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, the 88 quickly proved its worth. Against a backdrop of political experimentation and proxy warfare, German Condor Legion units discovered that the gun's exceptional velocity and large shell size made it devastating not only against aircraft, but also when turned level against tanks and bunkers, foreshadowing the deadly versatility it would demonstrate on much larger battlefields to come. By the time Europe plunged into the inferno of global conflict in 1939, the Flak 18 had evolved further, integrated into batteries where each of the 4 guns was linked to a central director equipped with sophisticated range-finding and targeting instruments. This setup allowed the guns to operate in concert, laying down synchronized, precise curtains of fire that could shred bomber formations or devastate columns of advancing armor. The sight of 4 coordinated 88s firing in unison was as awe-inspiring for German troops as it was terrifying for their enemies. In this way, what began as a cautious workaround to circumvent international treaties blossomed into one of Germany's most iconic and effective weapons of war. Whether thundering skyward to knock Allied bombers from the heavens or firing flat to tear through Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front, the 88mm gun carved out a legacy of dread that endures in military history to this day. Operating one of these 88mm guns was an exercise in intense coordination and disciplined teamwork. The gun layers had the critical responsibility of keeping the barrel precisely aimed at the designated target zone, guided by continuous updates from the battery's central fire control. This wasn't a casual affair. Every slight adjustment mattered when trying to predict the path of a fast-moving bomber thousands of feet overhead. Meanwhile, the loaders worked at a relentless pace, ensuring that fresh shells were rammed home the instant the breech was ready, the gun firing automatically upon each new round being seated. This rapid cycle of loading and firing demanded unwavering focus, as even a moment's hesitation could throw off the barrage meant to protect the ground forces or cities below. Lessons learned during the brutal proving grounds of the Spanish Civil War soon spurred German engineers to refine their design further. Out of this came the Flak 36, an improved version that replaced the original one-piece barrel with a smarter two-piece configuration. This change meant that instead of replacing the entire barrel when the inner rifling wore out, a cumbersome and logistically taxing task, only sections of the liner needed swapping, vastly simplifying maintenance and prolonging operational life on the battlefield. The accompanying carriage and trailer systems were also redesigned to speed up emplacement and breakdown, giving the crews more flexibility to move with the front lines or redeploy to fresh defensive positions. Following on its heels was the Flak 37, a model that didn't significantly alter the gun's physical structure but brought important technological enhancements. Upgraded sighting and fire control instruments meant that the gun layers could align their aim even more precisely with the targeting data fed from the command director, a feature especially vital when coordinating fire from multiple guns to create dense kill zones in the sky. It's worth noting that all 3 of these early war variants, the Flak 18, 36 and 37, shared the same imposing barrel length, measuring 56 calibers long. In practical terms, this meant the tube was 56 times the diameter of its 88mm bore, contributing to its remarkable velocity and flat trajectory. A standard round from this formidable weapon was a 17-pound high-explosive shell designed to reach soaring altitudes before detonating into a swarm of over 1,500 sharp, deadly fragments. Any aircraft unlucky enough to stray within roughly 200 yards of this airborne shrapnel storm risked being shredded in mid-air, with wings and fuselage alike punctured or torn away. The Germans didn't generally try to score pinpoint hits on individual aircraft from the ground, a near impossible feat given the speeds and altitudes involved. Instead, their strategy revolved around calculating the flight path of enemy formations, then hurling shells to explode at carefully predicted altitudes. Each shell would burst in a violent blossom of jagged metal, effectively sowing the sky with lethal hazards. When one of these shells struck directly, the result was catastrophic. The thin aluminum skins of Allied bombers and fighters simply couldn't withstand such brutal impact, often sending them spiraling earthward in flames. Visually, these detonations painted ominous patches of black smoke across the sky, warning incoming pilots of the deadly zone they were flying into. The sight of these dark, hanging clouds quickly became synonymous with danger, and it wasn't long before aircrews began using the term Flak, originally just shorthand for Flugabwehrkanon, as a general label for all anti-aircraft fire. This slang passed seamlessly into Allied vocabulary too, becoming one of the most recognizable words of the air war. Over countless battlefields, from the deserts of North Africa to the outskirts of Berlin, the bark of the 88 and the sinister puffs of flak bursts remained a constant, terrifying reminder of the power these guns wielded. The ammunition fired by these formidable 88mm guns came equipped with two main types of fuses, each tailored to maximize their deadly reach in the sky. Some shells carried barometric fuses, designed to trigger an explosion once they reached a preset altitude, ideal for creating lethal zones where bomber formations typically cruised. Others relied on precisely calibrated time delay fuses, set to detonate after a calculated number of seconds in flight, ensuring a dense barrage that could scatter through enemy air corridors. Regardless of which mechanism ignited them, the outcome was invariably grim. Thousands of razor-sharp steel splinters exploding outward with such violence they could effortlessly slice through metal skin and bone alike. It wasn't uncommon for these fragments to decapitate or dismember aircrew outright. Even those fortunate enough to avoid a direct hit often faced catastrophic damage to control surfaces, fuel lines, or engines, turning their aircraft into helpless, spiraling wrecks. What truly amplified the lethality of these guns was the sophisticated support infrastructure built around them. German air defense batteries were typically outfitted with advanced targeting systems, ranging from the mechanical Kommandogerät fire control computers to the cutting-edge Würzburg portable radar sets. These systems enabled crews to calculate firing solutions with remarkable precision, factoring in not only altitude and velocity of the approaching aircraft but also subtle offsets between multiple gun positions. Thanks to these innovations, several guns could be coordinated by a single command team, often no more than 5 specialists, directing a battery to aim and fire at the exact same patch of sky. This approach eliminated the need for each gun to have its own highly trained crew, making separate calculations, dramatically increasing the odds of overwhelming any enemy aircraft that dared to intrude. The terrifying versatility of the 88 didn't end with its war against the skies. As early as the 1940 campaign in France, these guns found new fame when German crews turned them horizontally against well-armoured French tanks. The gun's high muzzle velocity and powerful shells made short work of most armoured vehicles, a discovery that would shape anti-tank doctrine for the rest of the war. By 1941, specifically modified versions of the 88 were being deployed in North Africa under Rommels' command, where their ability to switch seamlessly between anti-aircraft and anti-tank roles proved invaluable against British Crusaders and later American Shermans. Part of this effectiveness came from the clever design of the carriage. The 88 could be fired in a limited anti-armor capacity while still mounted on its transport wheels, or quickly set up with the cruciform base fully stabilized in under 2.5 minutes, allowing German forces to react swiftly to threats in any direction. As the gun's reputation grew, so too did the Germans' appetite for diverse ammunition. By 1944, the German ordnance catalogue listed no fewer than 19 distinct shell types for the 88, 8 varieties of high-explosive rounds intended for air and soft targets, 7 armour-piercing designs tailored for anti-tank work, and several solid-core kinetic penetrators built purely to punch through steel. Among the most dreaded of these were the armour-piercing AP rounds. These shells combined brute force with advanced engineering. After slamming through a tank's armour, a delayed percussion fuse triggered a secondary explosive charge inside the vehicle, made visible by a glowing tracer element that let crews track the shell's path. While standard AP relied on sheer kinetic impact, the Germans also fielded hollow charge or shaped charge munitions, ingenious warheads that focused explosive energy into a superheated jet capable of burning straight through thick plates of armor, melting steel as if it were wax. This technology didn't just stay on static guns. The fearsome Tiger I heavy tank, which would become a legend of battlefield dominance, was born in large part from these developments. As early as 1936, long before the Tiger ever rolled off the production line, German planners were so impressed by the 88's performance that they drew up blueprints to mount it on an armoured chassis. When it finally arrived on the Eastern Front, the Tiger's 88mm cannon unleashed exactly the same terrifying punch that Allied pilots had come to fear from the ground, now in a mobile platform that could hunt enemy tanks across vast battlefields. In the end, whether pointed skyward to tear apart bomber streams or levelled against advancing armour, the German 88 was a weapon that reshaped tactics, terrified opponents, and secured its place as one of the deadliest and most adaptable guns of the entire Second World War. Although the 88mm cannon mounted on the mighty Tiger I tank shared the same ballistic capabilities as its anti-aircraft cousins, it was a distinctly specialised weapon in its own right. Officially designated the KWK-36, this tank gun featured a one-piece barrel encased in a slimmer jacket, a design optimised for turret use without compromising its deadly velocity and accuracy. Unlike the anti-aircraft variants, which typically relied on a horizontal sliding breech, the Tiger's cannon employed a vertical sliding breech block, mirroring the approach used in most other German tank guns. This was paired with a unique recoil absorption system that included a double baffle muzzle brake, cleverly engineered to reduce the punishing backward force that would otherwise strain the heavy turret and the tank's chassis. Even the trigger system reflected thoughtful adaptation to armoured combat. Instead of being positioned directly on the breech block, the firing mechanism was transferred to the gunner's handwheel at shoulder height, making it faster and easier to engage targets while tracking them through the optics. The Tiger's turret itself was a fortress of steel, thickly armoured on all sides, adding considerable mass to an already formidable machine, and contributing to the tank's reputation for being as ponderous as it was powerful. As for the ammunition, it remained virtually identical to the shells fired by the ground-based Flak A-18, 36, and 37 anti-aircraft guns. The only major difference was the use of electric primers, which required a modest 12-volt battery, similar to what you might find in a standard automobile, to ignite the propellant charge. Inside the tank, designers tried to balance firepower with practicality. Official capacity was listed at 92 rounds, stowed meticulously in racks around and beneath the turret. However, inventive crews often found ways to squeeze in extra shells wherever space allowed, keenly aware that every additional shot could mean the difference between survival and destruction. In combat, the results were devastating. The Tiger's 88 was so precise and packed such tremendous punch that it frequently achieved one-shot kills, turning engagements against Allied tanks into brief, brutal affairs. The psychological edge this conferred was immense. Allied crews often dreaded the possibility of encountering a Tiger lurking beyond effective return range, waiting calmly to pick them off. Parallel to the Tiger's success, German engineers pursued a purely anti-tank evolution of the 88. The formidable Pak-43. Entering production in the latter part of 1943, it quickly gained recognition among friend and foe alike as perhaps the most effective dedicated tank killer of the entire war. Unlike its anti-aircraft predecessors adapted for ground fire, the Pak-43 was purpose-built to destroy armoured vehicles. It boasted a robust two-part barrel that simplified replacement and a semi-automatic breech that sped up the loading cycle, allowing crews to sustain a blistering rate of fire even in intense engagements. Mounted on carriages that offered a full circular traverse, the Pak-43 could easily swing around to engage threats from any direction, a crucial advantage on chaotic battlefields where danger rarely approached in a neat line. Its high-velocity rounds could punch clean through the frontal armour of virtually any Allied tank, even at considerable distances. Meanwhile, the gun itself was protected by a distinctive shield of sharply sloped armour, designed to deflect incoming fire and enhance survivability for its crew. And this wasn't simply a close-range ambush weapon. With a maximum effective reach extending over 15,000 metres, more than 9 miles, 43 could also serve in a general artillery role, delivering suppressive or destructive fire against enemy concentrations far beyond direct visual contact. This remarkable blend of tactical flexibility and sheer penetrative power ensured the 88's enduring legacy, securing its reputation as one of the most feared and respected weapons systems of the Second World War. The formidable 88mm Pak 43 gun did not remain confined to towed carriages or field emplacements for long. Recognizing its extraordinary potential, German designers swiftly adapted it for installation on armored fighting vehicles. Among its most notorious platforms was the Tiger II heavy tank, often called the King Tiger, a behemoth of steel engineered to carry an equal load of 40 high explosive and 40 armor-piercing shells. This monstrous machine first rolled onto the Eastern Front in early 1944, confronting Soviet forces with a weapon whose sheer penetration power and long-range accuracy were virtually unmatched. Beyond the Tiger II, the Pak 43 found its way onto a wide array of self-propelled chassis, transforming it into a fearsome mobile anti-tank and bunker-busting system. One notable example was the Nashorn, or Rhinoceros, a relatively lightly armoured but swift vehicle designed to stalk enemy tanks from long distances, leveraging the Pak 43's reach to strike before most adversaries could react. Even more infamous was the Ferdinand, a heavy tank destroyer rushed into service just in time for the titanic clash at Kursk in the summer of 1943. Roughly 89 of these cumbersome giants were thrown into battle, where, despite significant teething problems with their mechanical reliability and lack of defensive machine guns, they reportedly destroyed up to 200 Soviet tanks. Those that survived the bloody ordeal at Kursk were later thoroughly upgraded with enhancements like a bow-mounted machine gun and improved optics, emerging with a new name, Elephant, and a reputation for raw killing power that few Allied tank crews envied. The Pak 43's lethal marriage with armoured hulls didn't end there. Engineers also mounted it on the Panzerjäger Panther chassis, producing the sleek and deadly Jagdpanther. This 46-ton Predator carried 60 rounds combined high mobility, capable of nearly 50 km/h on roads, with the devastating punch of the 88. Though fewer than 425 were ever completed, these tank destroyers saw action on virtually every front, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the snowy forests of the Ardennes. Even seasoned Allied tank crews regarded the Jagdpanther with a wary respect, knowing that its first shot often decided the engagement. Interestingly, Germany was not alone in fielding large-caliber anti-aircraft guns that doubled, at least in theory, as tank killers. Both Britain and the United States developed impressive counterparts, the British 94mm gun and the American 90mm. These Allied weapons could hurl heavier shells to even loftier altitudes, and on paper sometimes surpassed the ballistic figures of the German 88. However, their sheer bulk and weight proved limiting. While the Germans eagerly pressed their 88s into multi-purpose roles, using them not only against aircraft but also to blast tanks and fortifications, the Allies tended to keep their big guns tethered to their original anti-aircraft duties. This German approach drove a wave of technical innovations aimed at maximizing the versatility of their prized gun. Developments like power-assisted rammers sped up loading cycles, while sophisticated fuse-setting devices allowed crews to tailor shells precisely for airburst or impact, improving lethality against both aircraft and ground targets. Enhanced ammunition handling systems meant the guns could sustain punishing rates of fire without crew fatigue slowing operations. Together, these refinements turned the 88 into more than just a weapon. It became a flexible, deeply integrated tool of German combined arms warfare, equally adept at sweeping bombers from the sky, gutting tanks from over a mile away, or pulverizing stubborn strong points that blocked the Wehrmacht's advance. In every theatre where it appeared, the 88 cemented its place as one of the most feared and respected weapons of the entire war. What truly set the Germans apart was their inventive and remarkably adaptable approach to the original 88mm Flak. Instead of confining it to the narrow role of anti-aircraft defense, they continuously studied its battlefield performance and refined its use throughout the war. This willingness to experiment and modify meant the gun evolved far beyond its initial purpose. Its fearsome bursts against high-flying bombers were matched by its devastating power when turned against tanks, bunkers, and entrenched infantry. By mastering how to transition a single caliber across such varied combat roles, whether mounted on towering Flak platforms, concealed in field positions, or housed inside monstrous armoured hulls, the Germans forged the 88 into a legendary all-around weapon. It earned an enduring reputation not just as a piece of hardware, but as a symbol of German engineering ingenuity and battlefield versatility. Here, I present the authentic interview with Günther Vogel, who, as a teenager, served on an 88mm Flak anti-aircraft battery. He vividly recounts the harrowing moments he experienced in combat. We were conscripted in February 1944. Graduation was, by sheer coincidence, on D-Day, June 6, 1944, which we kids were not aware of, as we were busy setting up our 1937 model 20mm cannon in Neugraben-Fischbeck in the Elbe River area south of Blankenese, near Hamburg. We kids were never told the numbers or designations of the units we served in. Flak auxiliaries were drawn from high schools and then split up according to specialties, radar, communications, or weapons. My specialty was gunner on a 20mm model 1937, and as such, I was subject to being assigned to different batteries of 88s. Boot camp was named Fearsome in the state of Schleswig-Holstein. 1944, I was stationed in Hamburg during some big attacks, but a 20mm gun fires only so far. They decided that we were better used to protect an airfield near Hanover, so we were moved near the village of Barl. We arrived there August 2nd. On the 4th we were playing around on the gun, pretending to be shooting at planes. We had all those training planes, German Focke-Wulfs. We would take aim at the training planes as they landed as targets, yelling tack, 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 mimicking the sound of a gun shooting. There were 5 of us. I was sitting in the chair of the gun doing the plaything of shooting at ghost planes, when suddenly there was gunfire and an explosion. It was only a second and a half, and my buddy helped me turn the gun, and I just fired at the sound of an aircraft coming in from 3 o'clock to the east. All the training planes took off and landed to the west, 9 o'clock. This Mustang came from 3 o'clock and flew over a little woods adjacent to our gun. I was able to turn the gun and follow him as he disappeared at 9 o'clock, directly over us. He had his machine guns blazing, the rounds stitched the sand, like in a movie, to the left and right of us. Nobody got hit. I noticed that one of my rounds took off a piece of wing on the right-hand side of the plane. Then he zoomed up, he wasn't shot down, and took off and disappeared. The commandant of the airfield later congratulated us, and we were told we had shot him down. We, the gun crew, were promoted to other anti-aircraft batteries. After a short home leave, we were given orders and rail tickets to report to various Luftwaffe batteries nationwide. Mine was located in what then was called the Polish Protectorate near Odertal-Blechhammer in Upper Silesia, but no light AA gun was available, so I was retrained as a lateral gunner on an 88. At the beginning of the Soviet surge in January-February 1945, L was issued a Skoda double-barrel machine gun, 1918 vintage, packed for 25 years in the wooden crate and still stinking of industrial oils. It took me a week to figure out that 2 barrels demanded at least 3 hands. Those were provided by a grey-haired lieutenant, formerly a major in the 1915 Austrian army. We fought side by side during the long nights in February 1945 until all youngsters were withdrawn by unexpected orders from Hermann Göring, when it became known that the Soviets executed all underage enemies found with weapons as not covered by the Geneva Convention, something known as Franc-Tireur, a civilian sniper or partisan. I had 4 months left to become of age. I remember being on duty with an 88mm Flak unit during an American raid on the industrial area on August 22nd, 1944, as the combined dozens of batteries of 88s, 105s and 128s along the bomber route from Italy defended the approaches. A B-24 crashed near our battery. We young guys all volunteered, and I was allowed to participate in the honor salute to the fallen US airmen on August 24th. Absolutely. They occupied a village, a church belfry that had been occupied by a panzer unit with forward observers. The Russians eliminated a guard of 4 and then directed mortar fire on our position. One round landed right over me when I was bending down to pull a box of hand grenades. I was bending down while standing in the mud to pull the box to my position where I was defending with a machine gun. Just as I stood back up, a round exploded on the berm above me. I got hit by a piece of mortar shell on the rim of my helmet. I didn't even know that I was hit. They came in fairly high, but we were not privy to seeing them because our eyes were on the dials, indicators, directional instruments. Our eyes were nailed to that, so you couldn't look up to find where they were coming from. Most of the attacks came from the south, and then we followed them. We were at the foot of a mountain range, the Sudeten Mountains on the Czech-German border. Blechhammer was a death trap for American bombers because there were literally hundreds of guns, dozens and dozens of batteries along that whole range. Usually when they approached, like little silver arrows on the horizon, is how they came. We knew they were not coming for us. We were probably about 3 or 4 miles from the target. They never bombed us. Each day during the height of the air war, German anti-aircraft batteries unleashed tens of thousands of shells into the sky, forming vast, lethal clouds of shrapnel meant to tear Allied bombers from the heavens. The sheer volume of steel hurled upward was staggering, an iron storm designed to safeguard cities and factories from relentless aerial assault. Yet there's a question seldom explored in typical wartime histories. What became of all that flak once it was fired? For every shell that exploded near a formation of bombers, showering them with deadly fragments, countless others simply missed their mark, malfunctioned, or exhausted their timed fuses without ever finding a target. So where did these high-velocity steel shells end up? What kind of havoc did they wreak once gravity pulled them back to Earth, and who ultimately paid the price? To defend against the punishing Allied bombing campaigns, Nazi Germany built an extensive network of ground-based anti-aircraft artillery, collectively known as Flak. These guns were positioned everywhere, from open pastures on the outskirts of towns to rooftops deep within city centres. Most imposing of all were the colossal flak towers, hulking fortresses of reinforced concrete erected in strategic urban hubs like Berlin and Hamburg. Bristling with anti-aircraft guns, these towers not only served as formidable gun platforms but also doubled as air raid shelters for thousands of civilians. But while these batteries fired skyward to protect the population from bombs, the immense volumes of ammunition they discharged had unintended consequences. Tons of unexploded or spent shells, jagged shrapnel, and twisted steel fragments inevitably rained back down, often landing on the very streets and neighborhoods they were meant to defend. The ground beneath the battles in the air became its own hazardous front line, littered with lethal debris that claimed lives, damaged homes, and sowed fear among ordinary citizens. In cities like Vienna, Berlin, and Hamburg, massive flak towers loomed over neighborhoods, hulking fortresses of concrete bristling with heavy anti-aircraft guns. Each of these towers was armed with batteries capable of hurling dozens of high-explosive shells into the sky every single minute. Before the jet age transformed aerial combat with lightning-fast interceptors, these ground-based guns represented Germany's primary shield against Allied bombers, standing as the last serious barrier between enemy air fleets and the cities beneath. But flak was more than just a physical danger, it was a weapon of fear. Allied bomber crews often spotted the sinister black puffs of exploded shells long before they reached their intended targets, dark, smudged blossoms of smoke suspended ominously in the air. These eerie markers were a stark warning that they had entered hostile skies, where watchful gunners below were already tracking their formations. The heart of this formidable air defense network lay in weapons like the famed 88mm Flak A-36 and the even more advanced Flak 41. These guns could unleash up to 25 rounds per minute, propelling powerful shells thousands of feet upward in hopes of striking or at least maiming incoming aircraft. Each shell functioned much like an airborne grenade, loaded with a deadly mix of high explosives, often augmented with incendiary compounds for added devastation. It was designed to detonate at a carefully calculated altitude, triggered by a fuse preset by the gun crew before firing. When a shell reached its intended height, it burst violently, sending a spray of razor-sharp steel fragments racing outward in all directions. Any aircraft caught within this lethal sphere faced horrific consequences: shredded control surfaces, ruptured fuel lines, or worse, crewmen cut down by whirling shrapnel. Importantly, these anti-aircraft guns weren't engineered to score pinpoint hits on speeding bombers. Given the enormous distances and fleeting target windows, such accuracy was unrealistic. Instead, the strategy hinged on saturating broad swaths of sky with timed air bursts, dramatically increasing the odds that bombers would fly through at least some portion of these deadly fragment clouds. Flak shells varied in size, ranging anywhere from 75mm to a hefty 120mm in diameter, each carrying enough explosive force to carve out lethal airspace. Their explosions relied on fragmentation, turning precision marksmanship into a brutal numbers game. Saturate the heavens with steel, and sooner or later, something vital would be hit. For the bomber crews threading their way toward targets deep in the Reich, these roiling belts of shrapnel were a terrifying obstacle, one that could doom a mission long before fighter interceptors ever arrived on the scene. Still, the German reliance on timed fuses exposed a critical weakness in their anti-aircraft strategy. Once a shell left the barrel with its fuse preset, it couldn't adjust to the dynamic maneuvers of a bomber zigzagging or accelerating to evade flak. Even a modest shift in altitude or speed could render a perfectly calculated shot ineffective, causing the shell to burst harmlessly in empty sky, its lethal fragments dissipating too far from any target to inflict real damage. Yet despite this flaw, massed batteries of these guns often overcame such limitations through sheer volume. By filling entire sectors of airspace with overlapping bursts, they created deadly corridors that any formation of bombers had to penetrate, making each mission into hostile airspace a perilous gamble. For this reason, Flak quickly became one of the greatest nightmares haunting Allied air crews. Veterans of the 8th Air Force, or RAF Bomber Command, often described Flak as more terrifying than enemy fighters. Unlike an attacking plane that might be spotted and engaged, Flak was invisible until it exploded, and its detonations were unpredictable. Violent clouds of shrapnel appearing out of nowhere, rocking bombers, punching holes through wings and fuselages, sometimes killing or maiming crewmen outright. It's little wonder that serving aboard heavy bombers became statistically one of the deadliest assignments of the war. During some periods in 1943 and 1944, an Allied bomber crewman had only about a 1 in 4 chance of completing a full tour of missions unscathed. But the consequences of all this intense anti-aircraft fire didn't end with the bomber formations overhead. Every round fired into the sky eventually came back down. This meant that for every shell that found its mark, or at least burst close enough to shower a bomber with fragments, dozens more either detonated too soon, too late, or not at all. Once these shells had completed their lethal work aloft, the remnants, fragments, intact casings, and sometimes even entire unexploded shells were pulled by gravity back toward Earth. The irony was stark. German cities under heavy air defense protection were not just threatened by enemy bombs, but also by the very weapons meant to protect them. After a raid, streets, courtyards, and rooftops were often littered with jagged hunks of shrapnel and battered steel fragments, grim evidence of the storm of fire that had passed overhead. In some neighborhoods, children would venture out after an alarm to collect pieces of flak as macabre souvenirs, comparing who had found the largest or most twisted shards. While most flak fragments were relatively small and, by the time they completed their long fall, often lacked the mass or speed to cause widespread destruction, they were by no means harmless. Larger pieces retained enough velocity to punch through tile roofs, crack windows, and occasionally injure or even kill unwary pedestrians caught in the open. In fact, this risk was so recognized that civil defense manuals in Germany specifically advised citizens not only to seek shelter from Allied bombs, but also to stay protected until well after the bombers had departed to avoid injury from descending debris. There are documented instances from Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna where people were struck by returning flak fragments long after the air raid sirens had fallen silent. In Hamburg during the 1943 bombings, particularly around Operation Gomorrah, local hospital records include cases of civilians brought in with head injuries or lacerations from falling anti-aircraft debris. Similar reports exist from Vienna's inner districts, where flak towers stationed in densely populated zones created local hazards as much from their protective fire as from the raids themselves. So while Allied bombers faced terror in the skies from the flak clouds waiting to shred their formations, German civilians below contended with their own grim aftermath. Streets glittering with sharp, twisted fragments, buildings sometimes scarred by impacts, and the constant knowledge that each effort to protect them came with its own hidden dangers. It was a sobering reality of total war, one where the very act of defense could become, in smaller, haunting ways, another threat. Steel helmets and thick concrete weren't just precautions against falling bombs, they were also crucial safeguards against the very flak shells fired to protect them. Hard numbers are frustratingly elusive. Official German wartime records almost never singled out civilian casualties or property damage caused specifically by falling anti-aircraft debris, yet scattered anecdotes, local reports, and the occasional grim hospital ledger reveal that the risk was far from negligible. Even when anti-aircraft guns functioned exactly as intended, detonating shells in the sky to shred enemy bombers, they still littered vast swathes of urban landscapes with blazing hot metal shards. For anyone caught outside, this falling steel posed a real and sometimes fatal hazard. Reinforced shelters, bunkers, and helmets mitigated the threat, but nothing could eliminate it entirely. Clearer picture comes from an unlikely but telling example outside of Germany: the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. During that infamous morning, as American gunners desperately unleashed anti-aircraft fire at waves of Japanese planes, shells burst above and around the harbor, filling the air with lethal fragments. Only one Japanese bomb is known to have landed in the civilian city of Honolulu. Yet when the smoke cleared, 68 civilians lay dead and another 35 were wounded. A 1943 investigation by the Army's Pearl Harbor Board later determined that 48 of those civilian deaths were likely caused not by Japanese ordnance, but by America's own defensive fire. Many shell fragments found embedded in homes and bodies bore unmistakable US Navy manufacturing stamps, a sobering testament to how quickly even well-intentioned defenses could inflict unintended tragedy. Moreover, it wasn't just shrapnel. Unexploded flak shells were a persistent threat. Many of these heavy projectiles failed to detonate at altitude due to faulty fuses or abrupt changes in target height. When they plunged back to Earth, they often exploded upon impact with streets, courtyards, or rooftops. Though a flak shell didn't pack the sheer destructive power of a high-capacity aerial bomb, it could still blow out windows, shred facades, collapse small structures, or kill anyone nearby. Berlin and Hamburg fire brigades during intense periods of aerial combat sometimes reported being dispatched to sites not hit by Allied bombs, but by falling anti-aircraft shells, entire incidents caused solely by the desperate effort to protect the city's skies. And the danger of flak wasn't limited to the skies. On the ground, these same anti-aircraft shells, especially the common 88mm and 105mm calibers, often brought sudden destruction and death at terrifyingly close quarters. Even today, more than 80 years after the guns fell silent, their remnants continue to be unearthed across Germany. Alongside the more infamous dud bombs dropped by Allied air forces, unexploded flak rounds still lurk beneath fields, gardens, and city streets, grim reminders that not every threat of the war had come from enemy planes overhead. Some of the most revealing records on the true local impact of flak come from Berlin. During the war, the city's main air protection bureau meticulously compiled after-action reports following every air raid. These weren't just lists of houses crushed by Allied bombs or factories set ablaze. They also catalogued the sometimes startling extent of damage caused by Berlin's own defensive fire. A striking example appears in the official summary after a raid on September 7, 1941. Among the usual bomb craters and shattered rooftops, the report calmly noted damage caused by 57 German flak grenades, 10 of which were unexploded duds scattered throughout the neighbourhoods. In fact, during the early phases of the air war, particularly through the autumn of 1940, these records show a surprising pattern. More physical destruction in Berlin was caused by stray or malfunctioning flak shells than by Allied bombs themselves. During the very first air raid on Berlin on August 26, 1940, for instance, the handful of British bombs dropped caused only minor structural damage. Yet in the district of Dragons, a German flak shell misfired and exploded right in the street, injuring 4 civilians and blowing out windows across entire blocks. In Tiergarten, the imposing district hall lost nearly all its windows when another German flak round burst nearby. Meanwhile, in Wedding, a working-class district already bracing for war, flak shrapnel injured 7 civilians, one of them so badly that they were not expected to survive. The pattern continued. On September 7th that year, records from the Zehlendorf district noted that the only significant damage came not from Allied bombs, but from a single flak shell that smashed into a house on Herwarthstrasse. In Prenzlauer Berg, an unexploded anti-aircraft round plummeted straight through the roof of an apartment building at Dunkerstrasse 84, lodging itself ominously inside the attic. Authorities rushed to evacuate the family living there, fearful the shell might detonate at any moment. And Berlin wasn't unique. Similar local reports appear throughout wartime archives from Hamburg, Bremen, Vienna, and dozens of smaller German towns. Each tells a small but telling story about the double-edged nature of urban air defense. The desperate effort to fend off Allied bombers often came at a price borne by the very civilians these batteries were intended to protect. The dangers of unexploded ordnance and razor-sharp shrapnel are frequently mentioned in passing in post-war accounts, but reliable statistics on civilian casualties, especially among children, remain elusive. Wartime authorities often focused their reporting on bomb damage or enemy attacks, reluctant to emphasize harm caused by Germany's own protective guns. Yet scattered through memoirs, local histories, and the general literature of the Second World War is a recurring, almost haunting image. Children, armed with tin buckets or burlap sacks, scouring the rubble-strewn streets of their bombed-out neighbourhoods, eagerly collecting fragments of flak. In Berlin, Hamburg, London, even the battered streets of Leningrad and Stalingrad, kids treated these twisted shards of steel as war trophies, proudly comparing who had the largest piece or the most jagged fragment. In Germany, these activities were sometimes semi-officially encouraged by the Hitler Youth or local party officers, framing it as a kind of patriotic cleanup. Yet for all the innocent enthusiasm, these same bits of steel had only recently tumbled from the sky at lethal speeds, having already injured or killed countless anonymous civilians. So even as the black flak burst terrified Allied pilots far above, their hidden aftermath continued long after the raid had ended, lingering not only in the deadly shards that littered the streets, but also in the silent, unexploded shells that still lay buried beneath the soil, waiting to be discovered decades later. In London, historian Angus Calder recorded how local boys would scramble through bomb-cratered streets and shattered buildings on a determined hunt for shrapnel. They were especially proud if they could claim a chunk of a German bomb, far more coveted than the more ordinary splinters of British anti-aircraft shells. But the phenomenon wasn't confined to Britain. In Germany itself, amid the bombed and battered streets of Hamburg, Berlin, and countless smaller towns, children eagerly gathered fragments of flak. These fragments, fallen from the sky after missing or bursting wide of their intended targets, were gathered up and compared in playground contests of who had found the largest or most twisted piece of steel. Yet collecting these war mementos carried more than the obvious risks of unstable ruins. Historian Edward Westerman points out that these fragments, still sharp and sometimes searing hot, could easily slice flesh or cause devastating injuries. Children often roamed without protective clothing or helmets, even while raids were underway or while fresh debris still rained down. What to a child was a daring game could, in an instant, turn fatal. The danger wasn't unique to Britain or Germany. In besieged Leningrad, where deprivation bred a grim resilience, historian Richard Overy recounts how a young girl named Svetlana Magieva and her companions made a perilous sport out of chasing falling fragments. As anti-aircraft guns on barges along the Neva River fired skyward, these children would stand outside, vying to be closest when bits of metal clattered back to earth. Whoever retrieved a smoking shard first could claim it as their trophy, a chilling kind of courage that revealed just how normal danger had become. This widespread fascination with collecting shrapnel was so common that it eventually drew scholarly attention. Archaeologist Gabriel Moschenska explored the phenomenon in his study, A Hard Rain, detailing how, across war-torn Europe, children transformed deadly debris into keepsakes. Shrapnel wound up in jars on mantles or in boxes beneath beds, quiet relics of chaos that blurred the line between innocence and violence. Meanwhile, the sheer scale of anti-aircraft fire meant these scenes weren't confined to capital cities or major battlegrounds. By 1943, the skies over the Netherlands had become a routine transit route for Allied bombers striking deep into Germany. In response, German occupation forces saturated Dutch fields and towns with flak batteries. Guns became a permanent backdrop to village life, as ordinary as church bells. Day after day, these batteries filled the air with shells, many of which failed to explode or simply overshot their mark. Unlike bombs that detonated dramatically, these duds slipped back to earth with eerie unpredictability. Farmers might find spent shells embedded in their fields, while townspeople sometimes heard the unsettling thud of a round striking nearby soil. In luckier cases, these impacts caused little harm, but there were darker outcomes too, unexploded rounds that lodged in gardens or crashed through thatched roofs. And the damage from this ceaseless anti-aircraft fire was not simply theoretical or rare, it was extensively documented, particularly in occupied regions like the Netherlands. In fact, an extraordinary testament to both Dutch thoroughness and the sheer scale of the problem comes from the records kept by nearly 1,200 municipalities across the country. These local governments meticulously logged incidents involving falling flak munitions, each ledger a quiet archive of how deeply this indirect hazard became woven into daily life. The most frequent entries described non-explosive shells smashing through windows, splintering wooden beams, or punching ragged holes through tile roofs. Entire neighborhoods sometimes bristled with hastily patched shingles or boarded windows, scars left by shells that never even found their intended targets in the sky. More serious were the explosive rounds that did detonate upon impact. These caused localized devastation, killing livestock in barns, flattening wheat fields or vegetable plots just ready for harvest, and obliterating small workshops, sheds, or family-owned stores that had already survived the economic strains of wartime. So widespread was the fallout from these unintended impacts that the Dutch authorities, under the realities of occupation, worked with the German administrative machinery to set up a national fund dedicated to compensating those harmed. Every claim went through a rigorous vetting process. Officials would not only verify the extent of the damage, but also try to confirm the exact cause, conducting careful investigations to distinguish between harm from Allied bombing and destruction from German anti-aircraft shells. They also inspected properties for lingering dangers, additional debris, or worse, unexploded ordnance that might still be lurking in attics, gardens, or beneath barn floors, waiting to cause tragedy later. Once these sites were deemed safe, the remnants of the shells themselves were often gathered up by representatives of the German economic administration. Nothing in wartime went to waste. Even broken casings or twisted fragments were sometimes melted down and fed back into the vast machinery of the German war economy, transformed from accidental wreckage into raw material for yet more weapons. It was a strange paradox. where pieces of destruction were collected like a harvest and repurposed, their violent history brushed aside in the desperate calculus of total war. From the charred rooftops of Berlin to the flat green expanses of Dutch farmland, the imprint of flak extended far beyond its intended clash with enemy aircraft. It left behind shattered glass in kitchens, scarred walls along quiet streets, and an unspoken fear that even when bombers had passed, the danger might still come whistling down. It claimed the lives of farmers tending fields, struck children who ventured out too soon in search of metallic trophies, and forced entire communities to keep ledgers of damage and injury, strange bureaucratic memorials to the unintended costs of defense. And so as the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the legacy of Germany's flak did anything but fade. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The war had proven beyond any doubt the devastating effectiveness of concentrated anti-aircraft firepower, and militaries around the world took notice. Engineers and tacticians pored over captured German designs, especially the fearsome 88mm guns that had shredded countless bombers and halted tank advances dead in their tracks. These weapons directly inspired post-war developments, from Soviet and NATO heavy anti-aircraft batteries to improvements in tank guns that borrowed rifling patterns, recoil systems, and sighting technology first refined in the German flak factories. But it wasn't just hardware. The entire doctrine of layered air defense, with multiple calibers, rapid redeployment, radar coordination, and even camouflage techniques, took root globally, all born in part from lessons the Allies learned the hard way over Europe. Modern self-propelled anti-air systems, missile-guided defenses, and even close-in weapon systems on ships owe something to the chilling effectiveness of World War II's flak belts. Today, military historians and enthusiasts alike continue to study these formidable guns, often calling them the most infamous and bloody weapons of World War II, and for good reason. They represented the perfect storm of industrial might, engineering brilliance, and ruthless wartime necessity. The flak became a symbol of total war, where not even the skies offered refuge.